Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
So, Emily, you know that term so often used with startups that we're building the plane while it's flying? Well, I think we're seeing that happen in real time with Minnesota's cannabis legalization. It's certainly a shining example of that. This is something that we covered when this first happened. And since then, some of the maybe fallout is the right, maybe wrong term. We're seeing kind of what's happening as a byproduct of it. So I wanted to chat about that today.
Yeah, I know we covered this a little bit when it first happened on the pod, but it's taking more shape and some meaningful things have happened, including one of the questions we posited during that podcast is how are the regulated operators, the cannabis operators with licenses there on the medical basis, how are they going to react and respond to this? We kind of have our answer here. But do you want to take a back up and talk about some of the things that have been developing in the market since then?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just rewind even for those that aren't super familiar, because it is such a strange situation. But yeah, the legislature of Minnesota actually legalized cannabis. The law made it so that any hemp-derived cannabinoids, including THC and CBD, can be legally sold in food items, beverages, and topicals as long as the product contains less than the federal limit of 0.3% of THC per weight. And this is where the beverages and the edible stuff comes in, right? Because a gummy has enough weight to carry 5 milligrams of THC. And so they made this law, and then there's a limit, 5 milligrams per serving, 50 milligrams per package. And it kind of really surprised everybody. It was over the summer when this came out. I remember watching the press and everyone's like, did you mean to do this? We absolutely meant to do it. The Republicans who weren't necessarily excited about it when they realized that they had voted for it said it wasn't debated. The Democrats said, well, we don't have to debate everything, and maybe you should read the law. But since then, some local jurisdictions have set temporary prohibition on sales. And that's another thing we covered this week with the Leafly opt-out report. So now we're getting opt-outs of this Minnesota law. It was kind of crazy. I mean, it was very much that plane getting built because, every other market that we see comes with this, long rollout and setting up this entire infrastructure and licensing system and testing and traceability and everything that goes with it. And, here we are, still waiting for New York to open its first stores, years in the making here. And Minnesota just goes and legalizes it, which I think was a very pragmatic approach because they were seeing all these edibles coming to market. Like you can see in many regions, if you go online and you search Delta 8 gummies, Delta 9 gummies, you're going to be able to get those shipped most likely to your house. And this is all hemp derived THC and not tested necessarily, not in the system, certainly. And Minnesota was like, this is crazy. We should regulate this in some capacity. So let's just legalize it. Let's create some limits around it. But that was about all they had. They didn't really have much beyond that other than this is legal now. And there's some package size restrictions, but that's it. And since then, we're seeing some cool news, cool and crazy news, I would say. So just last week, Axios reported that restaurants in the Twin Cities there in Minnesota are adding THC to their menu. And they call out a few breweries. Craft and Crew Hospitality is the restaurant group that they talk about in this article, and we'll link to it in the show notes, are introducing THC seltzers, basically from breweries in the area that have incorporated THC into their product. And this article says that it's selling really well. Which is kind of surprising, not surprising, but I've never been in this industry 12 years at this point. I've never gone to a restaurant, sat down, ordered food and ordered a THC beverage. And I know that there are some places that have popped up like in LA that have done this type of thing, but it's so rare. But to know that, now this is a thing in Minnesota, it's kind of become pretty real pretty fast.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, that other episode we'll be putting out or have put out this week is about the jurisdictions and laying claim to having a market in your own jurisdiction around cannabis. And I think Minnesota was like, oh, we got to take back our industry because it's going to get here anyway. And they did it. And you make a really good point, too, because we have talked about consumption lounges and consumption dining experiences. And it really usually is it's kind of in a siloed experience in its own right. So you have to go to a special place, but now these guys are bringing these products into a place that's a space where people are, socializing around beer. So why not socialize around cannabis? And I also am reminded that Lagunitas was one of the first groups to jump in on the beverage side here in California in their partnership with Absolute Extracts or Cannacraft. And it makes sense to me because there is that very close relationship of hops to cannabis in terms of how you can work with these plants to make them into a beverage. And so I think it's a really interesting thing that we are seeing. And of course, they're selling well because, people just want access to cannabis. And so it seems like Minnesota is trying to take ownership.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. Like I enjoy going to a brewery from time to time, and it would be great if I could go in and get, an alcoholic beverage or a THC beverage, and just kind of neat to see breweries. I'm sure Lagunitas would love to do it. Lagunitas, out of Northern California there, and they have a whole tasting room here in Seattle. And, why not? Why not have it in both? Even, they were early adopters, but you really can't, have them. They're the only way you find those are at cannabis retail in California. Like we don't even have hi-fi hops up here. So, that's pretty exciting. It says that the Craft and Crew Hospitality Group did extra due diligence before debuting the drinks, and they checked with their insurance agent. Can we even do this? What kind of insurance do we need? And they added extra training for the staff, and they set a policy of no more than 3 THC drinks per patron, which is cool. So they're just kind of getting ahead of it, trying to cover it, but they're creating the structure. This is not coming from, Minnesota saying, you got to limit it to 3, treating it maybe like alcohol, like, you just don't overserve. Right. And it goes beyond these like restaurant groups. Coffee shops are getting in the game too. And, like you mentioned at the top of the recording, that this is not something new when we think about coffee shops and cannabis.
And, I do start to worry. It's funny. One of the things you mentioned, I thought before we started recording was that, a brewery is one thing. And I think even more so because they have to focus on, health and safety guidelines in terms of serving people food and beverage. But even more so, they live in this tighter regulatory framework of alcohol with beer. And so they're very attuned to kind of the pitfalls of not following kind of guidelines around these things, because then they can lose their license, they can lose their alcohol license, and that's a nightmare for a business like that. It seems like they're a pretty successful group. The coffee shop thing, I have mixed feelings on, and it may sound kind of out of the like counter to what I should say because of the beer thing, beer and cannabis, whatever. Some people have thoughts about mixing cannabis and alcohol, but on the coffee shop side, I just think that maybe it's a little bit more fast and loose because of what I saw in, for example, the New York market over the past few years, trying to lead into a regulated market. And they were just selling CBD as an add on to the coffee. And of course, being an educated consumer of cannabis, I tried to ask questions about the sourcing and the dosing and what's the blah, blah, blah. And the reaction I got was pretty just generally ill-informed to no-informed on that. And what was worse is it actually ruined my coffee because it was a really gross tincture. So, I paid up for something that then ruined my expensive New York coffee. And I thought, yeah, this is a really terrific way. And you could actually look at the CBD market in general. I know we're now seeing this tailwind with the Delta 8 and these things happening, but the CBD market in general has struggled because I think consumers did have disappointing experiences because it wasn't regulated and there wasn't a lot of quality control checking around it. And so wherever they were encountering it, be it at the point of sale at a bodega or at a gas station, or if it was just a random oily drop that went into your coffee and you didn't feel any better, because of course you're not going to feel better from one little drop of CBD because it's a cumulative effect, and there's a whole other thing to say around that. But I think that that's one of the things I want to make sure that Minnesota does try to figure out. And it was interesting to see what then happened next from one of the license holders from the medical cannabis program in the state.
Yeah, and this is something that you called out early on when we first talked about it. And you were like, well, how's this going to impact the legal medical license holders, of which I think there are 2. Is that right, in Minnesota?
I actually think it's 3.
It's 3?
Because it's Vireo. I think it's Vireo, Verano, and GTI.
GTI. Okay, gotcha. So Vireo was the headline this week, where they're actually suing the state to be able to sell adult use cannabis. It says the company said that the problem isn't exactly about conflicting statute on THC. Rather, it's that hemp-derived edibles that have recently been legalized in Minnesota do not have the same regulation, oversight, testing, and customer eligibility in the article published by Marijuana Moment. It says that there are simply not enough regulatory or law enforcement resources available to ensure that hemp-based edibles being sold in Minnesota are legal and safe. Where they're arguing, we're part of this rigorous framework, and we do have to abide by kind of this safety rule, which when you're talking about breweries and they're part of like the food service programs and all of that, but they're still not maybe testing the same way that you might have to test if you're producing under the legal framework. So I feel like, this was an inevitability. I would do the same thing if I was one of these license holders, and you see this stuff at the restaurant you go to in the evening, yet people can't come into your stores where it's grown and tested and gone through all this the structure that's been set up. So I have to imagine if Minnesota was so quick to legalize edibles and beverages just because of this challenge, that they would do something here for the operators. I think it would be really strange if they didn't, if they said, no, you're not part of this. You're part of a totally separate thing, when it just doesn't seem right. So I think all the points that Vireo is making here are fair, and surprised it took this long for them to go after the state.
I think so. And so the state's either going to have to figure out how to create a parallel path. And I do think it's a good thing, given everything I just said, that they should have some regulations around what the supply chain is to get this product to the consumer. And if it's going to come from the legal medical operators, or if it's going to come from another source, but then you have to go through a same rigorous, maybe not as rigorous, but rigorous guidelines around getting it into the consumer's hands. I think all of that is pretty important, just because we don't want to have another, one of the industries that went widely unchecked was the e-cigarette category. And then, all of a sudden it got a ton of attention, and the smackdown was, I would consider it was an overcorrection, because then you saw combustible cigarette consumption going back up again, which is not really, I think, what the regulators had in mind. But I just think it's better for them to get ahead. And yes, that was a massive national scale issue, and that was the FDA, which moves slowly unless there's NyQuil chicken involved. But they tend to move slowly. And then, but this is a state, and a state can be more nimble, and they just implemented this, so it's an opportunity for them to jump right in and say, okay, so here's some clarification.
Yeah, and this isn't the only fallout. Bloomberg has an article on how employers in Minnesota don't know how to deal with drug testing right now. And employers in Minnesota can obviously still take certain actions against people that test positive for THC, particularly while they're doing the work, right? So you can't be driving a forklift around a Costco, intoxicated on anything, cannabis included. But the challenge is, under the scope of what employers can do under Minnesota's what they call a lawful consumable products law, says employers can't refuse to hire a job applicant or discipline or discharge an employee for consuming products like alcohol and tobacco in their free time. And so, this is a lawful consumable product now. I mean, you can buy it at the restaurant. So, that really does disrupt a lot of testing. There are still jobs, surprisingly, out there that require some form of drug testing prior to even, applying. And now they're saying, well, this is, a legal thing. You can't do it. So they're trying to figure that out. In California, they've actually gotten in front of this by explicitly passing a measure that goes into effect in 2024 that bars employers from discriminating against workers who consume marijuana in their off work hours. But in Minnesota, it's already kind of part of this lawful consumable products law. So this is, just more kind of, again, building that plane while we're flying it. Everyone's just kind of figuring it out. And I don't think this is going to be the last headline we see about what's going on in Minnesota. To me, I like, the fast tracking nature. Maybe it's just my impatience with all of this, and how I am with like treating cannabis like some sort of radioactive subject. Like, we were in Chicago at Benzinga, and we visited some stores, and in Illinois, product can't be out. You can't see it, right? It's all behind iPads, and have to get it from the vault. And it just, I think it kind of perpetuates the stigma of this, right? Where it's like, whoa, don't look at it. It's like when stores, first opened in Washington, you couldn't have, any visibility into the store. And of course, that just makes you more curious and more taboo, right? Like, what is behind those doors? That's since changed, right? And I think that, this helps destigmatize it when you can see it on a menu at a restaurant. Maybe people won't think it's so terrifying, but I think it comes with its caveats too, right? Like, there's going to be some stuff that's not straightforward, some stuff that you're going to have to figure out. But the good news is they have to figure it out because it's happening, versus like just continuing to kick the can down the road and say, well, we'll figure it out later. We'll figure it out later before we open up the market. It's like the market is here. People are buying this stuff. The stuff can't stay on the shelves or the restaurant floor or wherever they store these drinks. They're moving quickly, it says. And so I think it's just net positive in the end. Not that it, doesn't come with its downsides, but I think that for the industry, it's again, it's like that, this whole like states are the laboratories, right? And we can test these things and try different things in different places. And maybe this works for Minnesota, maybe it doesn't work for California, but someone can look at Minnesota and say, hey, we can try it here too. So I think it's good. But of course, there's going to be more and more fallout as time goes on.
Yeah, I agree with you. The analysis paralysis has been amazing in the space, and no one's going to get it perfect. But I mean, even Minnesota, now that this has started to move quickly, maybe it will get them to focus in on just look to your left and look to your right. What states have done things that have worked well? Like, for example, the California thing. It's very easy to borrow from what works well and just implement that so that you can keep going. And I think it's a great thing. I don't know. One of my favorite places is this place called Psycho Susie's in Minnesota, and maybe they'll come up with a cannabis botanical beverage to go with their menu, but that would be fun.
Well, that sounds like a good plan. And if they're not, they should be thinking about that, because that would be really cool. And so if they do, or I don't know, we should probably just get out to Minnesota to see this. We can go to one of these restaurants, order some hot dish, grab a THC beverage to go with it. It'll be a fun little adventure.
I like it. Count me in.
Let's do it.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.